what I found in the basement.
Looks dumb and old.
I like it.
I had this vision for the game to be not a board game with dice that are rolled, but instead to be this really cool, vintage, wind-up tin toy, you know, sort of like a post-war Japanese pressed tin, mass-produced game. I was always captivated by the stuff of my father's generation. You know, my dad was a baby boomer. He grew up, you know, during World War II and after World War II when all of that technology was sort of new. And it was always interesting to me. So even though I didn't grow up with it, I was always a bit obsessed with all of that vintage stuff. You know, it almost has a spirit to it. So we wanted to put a lot of character in the game. We wanted it to be something that would be very intriguing to a young kid like Danny as he found it. But first and foremost, the game itself had to be interesting and exciting to look at when he winds it up and the piece moves around. And so I think, you know, we did a really nice job in designing something that, although it's new and goes beyond whatever really did exist, yet feels very familiar to the period.
The game is a game of dice in the book, and there's none of the qualities of this thing. We took a big leap in that area, but right from the day one we did. I think that was Jon's desire not to have the rolling of the dice game at all, and then we started talking about the metal game with the key and all of that stuff. But we kept the game slightly nostalgic, but we also kept it mysterious to a certain degree. Right up to the very end when it spits out the last card and tells you, oh, the game's over and you're still in space.
Game over. Thank you for playing.
That's it?
Now what?
There is an edginess to the game. There is a mystery to the game that we wanted to maintain. The other thing is the board had to be, there had all these parameters. The kids had to be able to carry the board and walk around with it through the whole movie, and we couldn't give them something that was too big that they couldn't carry. The design of the game was really trying to go from point A to point B, and what would it look like in between. And Jon was very specific about maybe having it go up one way and come down and then cross back over, and I thought it should have a little bridge that goes up and around, and then at the end of it, since it is a black hole, we thought it should kind of spiral around the black hole. So all these things started happening and coming together, and the thing that Jon and I were obsessed with were some of the specific pieces of it. The little spaceships and having enough, you know, following each other around. The rolled sides of the game, which I mentioned earlier, were really, really important. And then one day a guy walked into my office who's a wonderful illustrator, concept illustrator, named Phil Saunders.
The key thing that conceptual drawing really had to achieve was to present something that everyone could really look at and go, yes, this is what we're talking about. This is the kind of thing that's going to express that 50s philosophy. The other thing was the graphics. We spent a lot of time looking through old books on Buck Rogers comic strips or Flash Gordon, and those were a real inspiration for the kind of drawing that they would have had, that the simplicity of their spaceship designs and also the simplicity of the line work, and even down to the way that the colors in the lithograph would be offset and a little bit out of register. And it really gave that feeling of, wow, this is something authentic. This is something that's been in somebody's basement for 40 years. In the context of the movie, the game itself becomes another character. It really becomes the antagonist in the story. And so it really had to have a personality. It had to have things that moved and maybe gave a sense of foreboding at some points in the story, gave a sense of excitement that this was something that held a lot of possibility as you started playing this game. So the challenge was really to create something that seemed very, very real, something that seemed very familiar to people, but also something that was a little bit magical. First, we had to work on developing the path that the spaceships would take, figuring out how many steps would be played in each moment in the script. So once we developed the layout and we'd gone through and figured out how many spaces there would be, we started working on conceptual sketches for what it would physically look like.
Danny, take your turn. There's no key! Find it!
Well, the key was another interesting challenge because in the script they're talking about rolling dice. And in the end, I think, everyone hooked onto the idea of a skate key because it was something that could physically be handed over from one character to another, sort of the passing of this is your turn. So we spent a while working on a number of designs for that. I think I did a large page with probably a dozen or more different designs based on a lot of the typical keys that we had found in reference of old games. And I think we ended up going with the one that almost everybody preferred, which was a very traditional-looking key. Very simple, cheaply made, but that still had some of that magic to it that you get from something authentically old. The challenge with making a prop like that work for camera is that you have to think of it not just as a product, but also as a piece of a set, really. I mean, you're going to have a camera in there very close. You have to tell a story with this game as well. And this really becomes the marker of progress throughout the film. You follow those spaceships and where they are along this path as an indicator of how close these characters are to their goal. So it was very important, particularly in the storyline about Danny and his brother being somewhat competitive, Danny never getting to win. It was very important for us to always have a clear view of where those ships were in relation to each other, who was winning at any given point, because that became a very emotional issue throughout the story.
Danny, you won.
I won? You won?
You won, Danny. You beat the game.
So I started from those ideas and ended up doing one sort of key perspective sketch of the game as a whole that I thought fitted that philosophy or that aesthetic of the 1950s stamp tin toy, and showed it to Michael, showed it to John, and it was an instant hit.
Months before this film ever went into production, Michael Riva and Jon Favreau and Phil Saunders sort of designed and came up with the concept and the idea behind the game, at which point they handed off to me and say, okay, make this happen now. So it was my responsibility to figure out how to make the ships move and how to make the card pop out, how to make the spinner spin. So I sort of have to take the blueprint and make it a physical being, so to speak, in this case. I can't stress enough how much I feel like this game is a character in this film, and I treated it like that. So my responsibility was to figure out how to mechanically make this work and put it out there so that it could be a practical prop. Basically, there's 5 elements to the game. You turn the key, which then pops the button. You push the button, which then spins the number, and then that tells the cars how many spaces to move, and then the card pops out. So we had to connect all those elements together, and unfortunately we couldn't. It can't just be a robotic machine all in one, so I have to be off camera pushing little cue buttons to make all those elements happen. So I cue the button to pop, and as soon as the actor touches the button, I cue the spinner to spin. And once the spinner stops spinning, I cue the cars to move, and then when they land, I cue the card to come out, and the actor is able to take the card out, read the card, and whatever that card says affects the entire house. There's one issue that the 2 ships had to automatically move without a person touching them. So there's tons of little stepper motors inside there connected to computer chips, and I program it off camera with a little box that will tell the ship land on space 14 or red car 14 and blue car 12. There's also there's a card that pops out of the game. What we used is an ATM motor. So when you stick your ATM card in the ATM machine, we took that motor and feed our cards out of the games.
In order to win the game, you have to get to the end, which is Zathura. So then this planet comes up off the game and it starts spinning, and spinning really, really fast, and then it opens up, and then the black hole appears. It's really cool.
The ball game, when it starts to spin and rise and open, at some point becomes computer graphics. So the mechanical parts, which were my responsibility, were to spin the ball, shoot out the sparks, make the ball rise, and open the ball. In order to accomplish all that, we had to build a 5-foot platform and put 3 guys underneath a table that ran, the machinery. There's hydraulics involved to make it raise. There's motors involved to make it spin. There's grinders under there to make it spark. And so it's an incredible rig underneath a table with 3 human beings under there to make that all happen while we're filming. The game box was just important to Jon Favreau and Michael Riva, as was the game. So Michael Riva spent hours and hours on the set aging this game, just every fine detail of every corner of the box, and we all just sort of worked together and said, hey, let's try charcoal here, and let's try wax here, and there's a raised portion of the game right here in this box, so it might be worn down a little more there, or here, So we sort of all teamed together with Michael Riva at the helm with rags and rubbing and sandpaper, and it was really an actual fun process that we went through to accomplish making the game box looking the way it did. The first time that I came to the set and presented the game to the boys, Josh and Jonah, their immediate reaction was to grab that game and run with it. Thankfully, I handed them the dummy game and they were allowed to. So they had no idea really what they were in for. And they had no idea what this game was about to do. And so I then brought in the mechanical game, and I explained to them how sensitive it was and how incredibly, careful we have to be with the game, which kind of, put them in sort of like this, weird space. So I lay the game down, and I start putting it through its mechanics, and the 2 boys were in awe. They were just sort of like looking down at the game like, how is this happening? So they were very excited, and then from there, the immediate reaction from Jonah was, I got to touch this. So you immediately reach out to grab the ship that's moving all by itself. And of course, that gave us all a heart attack. Jon Favreau, Michael Riva, everybody just went, whoa, 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 don't touch the game. And so it was sort of this weird space with the game in that the boys had to learn how to respect the game as if it was another actor. So respect, space, we had to sort of practice all those elements of life with the boys, and they finally, you sort of get to understand it. And soon after, Jonah came sneaking up to me and he said, can I please run the game? And so I handed him the remote box, and I taught him how to run the game. In fact, Jonah is probably the only other person in the world that knows how to run this game right now.
The job of being a filmmaker is to take something very familiar and expand upon it in a way and go places where reality cannot. But to have the jumping off point as a familiar feeling that people have in discovering something in a thrift shop or discovering something in your dad's, trunk in the attic is a fun place to start to take people on, a crazy adventure like Zathura.